Afternoon from London, and I know we have people joining us from all around the world, so good morning or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to this webinar on shaping public investments for the net zero world. I'm Siobhan Bonita, I'm a former UK senior civil servant, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum and our knowledge partner today, Deloitte. Now, in terms of today's topic, even before the pandemic, governments around the world were rethinking their plans for public investment in order to meet evolving social, economic, and environmental priorities. And now, as the world slowly emerges from COVID-19, with economies seriously impacted by the last 2 years, and at the same time with even more focus on the reduction of carbon emission targets post-COP26, this agenda is being revisited again. In this webinar, we'll discuss the factors shaping decisions on public investment and how civil servants working with the private sector as well can really best equip themselves for the challenges to come and ensure that wider goals such as the drive to net zero, economic growth and public well-being are effectively built into the funding decisions that they make. We have a really great panel with us here today, and I'll be introducing them in a moment. And we'll hear from each of those panel members before we get into our discussion. But there'll also be an opportunity for you, the audience, to put your questions to our great panel. So whichever device you are using today, you should see at the bottom of your screens, there's a Q&A function. Please use that Q&A function, that button, to send in your questions at any point throughout this webinar from now onwards. It really is a great opportunity to put your questions to our panel. So in terms of our panel themselves, first we will hear from Cristiana Bellu-Manescu, who is a senior economist in the National Fiscal Frameworks and Institutions Unit in the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs, which she joined in 2014. In this capacity, Cristiana carries out policy and analytical work on public investment, management and fiscal rules. Then we will hear from Ipek Gentsu, who is a Senior Research Fellow on Climate and Sustainability at the ODI. Ipek has over 10 years of experience in climate and energy policy with a focus on sustainable finance, and she currently leads ODI's programme of work on fossil fuel and energy subsidies, as well as migration as an opportunity to support low carbon and climate compatible development as part of the ODI's Human Mobility Initiative. Then we will hear from our knowledge partner panel member today. So we'll hear from Michael Flynn, who is Global Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Government Sector Leader for Deloitte. In this role, he leads a global team working with public sector organisations on large investment programmes in infrastructure, mobility, climate, environment, cities, and much more. And then last, but by no means least, we will hear from Mariano Mazzaro, who is a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund. His work and research focuses on public finance, political economy, and infrastructure development. He's got a really interesting CV. So in 2005-2006, he was also Deputy Minister of Finance of Poland and Chairman of the State Development Bank, BGK. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we have a really stellar panel with us here today. As I said, please do use this opportunity to send in your questions. We'll get through as many of those as we can once we've heard from our panel. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Cristiana to give us her opening remarks. Cristiana, we have to take you off mute.
So thanks a lot, Siobhan, twice. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today with my fellow panelists and the audience for what promises to be an interesting discussion. I will give a few takes on the EU perspective to this debate. So if we can move on to the next slide. I will say that the EU is strongly committed to the green transition. The green transition is a key priority for the EU. The European Green Deal set out in 2019 is a policy framework with many different ambitions, including becoming carbon neutral by 2050. At the same time, this green transition is going to require a lot of adjustments. The European Commission estimates that up to 650 billion will be required annually up to 2030, both for the green and digital transition. Clearly, much of this funding will be provided by the private sector, but at the same time, public investment is going to play a key role. And on that, we can move on to the next slide. So when the COVID crisis hit in 2020, the European Commission came up with a temporary recovery package, that is the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And at the same time, it took this opportunity to further the green ambition by integrating a green target into the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So how this works is that the plans that the member states submit with investments and reforms in order to require funding have to include a 37% green target. And at the same time, all these investments and reforms that of the member states need also to respect the do no significant harm principle. And what is encouraging is that based on the data, the plans that have been submitted so far, which is for most member states, it seems that the green target has been even slightly overachieved, and even more so for the digital targets. And so to conclude my remarks, we're going to the next slide, and in this remarks, I want to say a few words on a number of initiatives that are taken at the EU level. It's clearly not all of them, so this is a selection influenced also by those that I know best. So I would start with the green taxonomy. The European Commission has put forward a classification system for economic activities in terms of their environment sustainability. It was put forward in 2020 and it has multiple uses. It's also used by the RRF, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, but also quite importantly, it is also used in the discussion on the green bond standards. There is also the InvestEU, which is a program meant at leveraging private investment with EU contingencies, so with the EU guarantee. And all these investments, part of the InvestEU, need to have climate proofing. So the investments need to show how they will achieve the climate targets. Then coming to a work stream that I know best, which is the one that I am in charge of at the European Commission, we started looking more closely at ways to improve the management of public investment in the member states, given all the, the ramp up in investment that we're talking and are expecting. So this becomes even a more important area. And here we are working with, especially with the member states, but also with other international organizations to see, to find ways for member states to improve their efficiency. The last two elements, I would mention some work done by colleagues with respect to disaster risk management and trying to anticipate, to make, again, EU member states more aware of the costs that are going to come in relation to climate mitigation and adaptation. So there we are looking especially at developing a strategy at the country level with a special focus on the financing of such needs. And finally, I would we do some work with respect to green budgeting, which relates to using the tools available to budgetary policy making that can advance the green agenda at the level of the budgetary process. And some of those tools include, for example, tagging the items used in national budgets into those that contribute positively or negatively. to meeting the environment. It can also be about integration of climate-related risk into fiscal policy making, but also impact assessments on the environmental impact assessments. I would stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Christiana. A really nice place to start, I think, because I think you've raised some of the issues that I'm sure other panel members will talk about and that the audience will be interested in kind of getting into more depth on. So in particular, those kind of the priorities that maybe were already there, the kind of digital transition, the green targets that were there, but also how at the European level, how those are now being connected to the recovery and resilience work post-COVID, making sure that those are linked together. And I think, again, a really important issue that you've raised there, about how do civil servants start to measure the sustainability of initiatives? How do they really know how green things are that they are thinking about investing in? So whether that's kind of working with contractors or, as you say, as well, looking at their own budgets as well. So really interesting about some of the taxonomy and the tagging that you were talking about there. So really good place to start. And I'm sure EPAC has some thoughts on some of those things, not least the risk management and disaster risk as well. So thank you, Christiana, and over to you, EPAC.
Thanks, Siobhan. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you today and to be with my fellow panelists. I would like to take us back one step to think about the science behind what we're doing and our climate aims. You know, aiming for net zero in the second half of the century, that's a very long way away. And it's fantastic to see more and more countries, you know, subnationals, private sector, financial institutions starting to take this agenda seriously. And signing up, many of them, to net zero commitments in the second half of the century. But this means actually much earlier on, by 2030, halving our emissions. So if you could point to the next slide, please, Alexa, you know, what does this mean in terms of what we have to do now over the next few years to try to make sure that we stay on the right trajectory? And this graph from the Climate Action Tracker shows you that actually, despite all the great progress so far, we are still not able to meet our climate commitments. And according to the Paris Agreement, of course, 2 degrees global warming in comparison to pre-industrial levels is the absolute maximum. We want to limit global warming to that, but really aspire for 1.5. And this graph, based on the analysis they've done, shows you that current policies are actually projected to result in about 2.7 degrees warming still, which is disastrous. And the level of adaptation and risk that entails is just too great for us to bear. So the nationally determined contributions, countries' climate plans, do help us get a bit closer to our target, to around 2.4 degrees. And when you do take into account the sort of next scenario, when taken into account sort of binding long-term targets and net zero targets, then we are getting a bit closer to our goal. And finally, they've realistic scenario. If we take into account net zero emissions targets of over 140 countries, which are either adopted or under discussion, and we assume that most of those are hopefully implemented, then we do get to somewhere around 1.8 degree warming, so below 2 degrees. But what you can see in this graph is that those crucial next years, in sort of the 5 to 10 years, let's say, in the lead up to 2030 or around then, where we have to drastically change the shape of that curve. Otherwise, it's going to be too hard to get back on track somehow down the line. And so what that means is we have to decarbonize faster. And to do that, as you all know, we have to start ramping, winding down our biggest source of emissions, which are fossil fuels. So on the next slide, I also show you a little bit where we are in terms of the world's developed fossil fuel reserves. As you can see, they actually bring us quite a way closer to 2 degree global warming. And so what we have to do is to keep much of those world's developed coal, oil, and gas reserves in the ground to make sure that we can aim for 1.5 degrees. And this is what I would like to say about government investment is that even though it's fantastic that we're seeing green initiatives, renewables and clean technologies developing and government supporting those, as well as adaptation and risk mitigation measures, what we really have to do is to bring an end to investment in fossil fuels. On the next slide, I can talk you through a little bit in terms of what the different stages of investment are for governments. So anything starting with exploration of fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, to sort of developing those reserves, extraction, processing them, distributing them, and then on the consumption side, you know, all the different consumers that continue to rely on a very highly fossil fuel based economy in buildings, in transport, in energy provision in particular. So some of our research at ODI, which is based on, you know, other organizations' research as well, tries to bring to light the level of investment that governments still make in fossil fuels, which includes, for example, domestic subsidies to fossil fuel production and consumption. In 2019 alone, governments provided $468 billion of subsidies for fossil fuel production and consumption. And the more there are these incentives for consumption, transport systems and energy systems, the more we are addicted to this way of being and the levels of emissions that we have. Governments also invest in fossil fuels through state-owned enterprises, energy companies, utilities. And then finally, there's a lot of public finance that goes to fossil fuels domestically and abroad as well, through export credit agencies, for example, that are supporting businesses abroad. So I think this is just to say that, you know, we absolutely must keep the really important goal of winding down fossil fuel production and consumption. It is challenging, of course, because it's, you know, part of our lives in many aspects, and making these decisions, especially in terms of the transition, you know, for the workers who are employed in those sectors, it's going to be a big transition, as well as the consumers who rely on the energy. And, you know, the recent energy price crisis, for example, shows how much we are at the mercy of fossil fuel price volatility. And, you know, when people's gas bills, etc., increase, the government has to be there to support them, to cushion away some of that support, but some of that impact. But what they really must do is to try and support them with alternatives, with alternative energy measures, and also increasing energy efficiency as much as possible through insulation and other kinds of energy efficiency investments. So I'll end it there, just with the main point that it's fantastic to see the great effort that governments and subnationals are making, but we have to try harder, because otherwise it's going to become impossible to change our trajectory to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you. I'll hand over there.
Thanks so much, Ipek. So nice, you know, recognition of the progress that's been made. Good that people are now taking this very seriously as a mainstream issue. But that real challenge there, as you're saying, especially to our kind of civil servants and public servants in the audience, that actually decisions that they make now are going to be crucial for that kind of medium and longer term success. Really succinctly, I think you put there, it's not only what people decide to invest in, it's that needing to stop investing in the fossil fuel industry as well. And then I think you've raised another issue which people will be interested in picking up on, probably, is how do you manage that transition? Because this is going to have a huge impact both on people who work maybe in some of these less sustainable sectors at the moment, but also for consumers. And so how is all of that going to be managed? So some really important issues that you've pulled out there. Thank you so much, Ipek. Now we're going to go over to Michael. It'll be interesting to get your view, Michael, having worked with so many different kind of civil services, I think, around the world. Over to you.
Thanks, Siobhan, and it's great to be here today. And this is really the topic that's central in many governments as they look at investment going forward, and certainly in their citizens and voters as they consider what to take forward. If you go to the next slide. The last 2 years, as we all know, we've been busy trying to get through COVID, and we're slowly beginning to get through that health crisis. And now governments are, you know, as we emerge, we're focused on that sort of governmental necessity of getting the economy back up and running. And historically, that's nothing new. We've had various crises and issues in the past, and governments have looked at that, stimulating the economics from the economic activity, supporting those businesses that might be distressed, and really just getting people back to work. And what we've seen in the past is we've seen infrastructure as one of those key areas where there is it aligns with that stimulus, because it provides that fiscal stimulus. It's an immediate impact both on from an employment point of view, but it also provides that longer term benefit. And it also, in terms of governments, what they've done is they've looked at prioritizing what they can get, what's shovel ready, how do they get that immediate impact. Now, that has been what's happened in the past, and was beginning to happen. And you've seen lots of governments have infrastructure packages that are being put together. Nothing new, and in total, that's about 5 trillion a year. But what has happened during the last 2 years is that all the research that we did during that period is on top of the health issues and economic piece. There was this societal demand around green, around climate, around equality, around making sure that ESG agenda, but as we're talking about today, the climate agenda was brought in. And so those demands needed to be aligned with how government looked at this. So there's now a shift in the objectives. So it's still, there's still that infrastructure investment required, but you're looking at clean growth. You're looking at employment equality. You're looking at equality of access to assets and to infrastructure and services that may not have been looked at before. And there is greater demand for this climate to be included, and there are, while it's still a stimulus package, it's still there in terms of having that environmental aspect to it. But that has caused government to do a number of things. It is brought in various, as have been called out today, there were various schemes that like EU Green Deal, leveling up, even the Biden Build Back Better is all around that, focus on climate and getting things moving. But how government has looked at evaluating, they're looking at including environmental impact and even the response to the climate from suppliers within the supply chain, and how that's included is being brought into evaluation. We're seeing greater focus on tech and digital in terms of not only how we operate and have the infrastructure, but also in terms of how we plan. So we're beginning to not only look at those operational elements, but the environmental impact as well as those physical and economic impact. But that all comes with a cost. And so while we did have a rough run rate of about 5 trillion planned per annum, that's now gone up to about 6.9 according to OECD in terms of funding. And the challenge now is with governments having spent an awful lot of money on COVID and supporting is how do they make sure that they deliver against this? And we saw previously when it was only at 5 trillion, about only half of that could be supported by the public sector. So there's a big gap, and an even bigger gap now to achieve this. But that's not a bad thing, because aligned with all of what we're looking at is the financial services sector, and particularly funders and investment managers are also looking at climate, and they're also saying that they want to lend in and provide invest in climate projects, and those are projects that meet environmental criteria, and so the private funding and infrastructure provides a very good platform for private finance. But it allows that now when you have climate focused projects properly structured, you now have this greater demand by the funding market to get involved in these projects. So even though there's a greater funding gap and need for private finance, there is that availability of funding that's there, and now just needs to be tapped. So there's lots of challenges to be delivered, but there is a stimulus to be achieved. I think there not only is there the need to do this, but there is that societal demand and even government commitment in order to do this. So Lots of challenges, lots of money to be spent, but I think the commitment is there to deliver. So we can happy to discuss later on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael. Again, lots of interesting points there. I like the way that you say this time, you know, in infrastructure, kind of big stimulus packages are nothing new, especially after kind of big economic disruptions. But this time, I think different in that, you know, society's not going to stop demanding now that is, as you put it, a clean growth, so that whilst the economy is taken into account, we don't forget as well those environmental and social objectives as well. For the civil servants, again, I think, as you said, some of the things that are changing maybe is an increased focus on tech going forward, and also that sense of how do they measure the sustainability of their entire supply chains. So not just looking at the project over, going into depth in the supply chain. And then really interesting what you said at the end, this isn't just the public sector, it has to also be the private sector playing their part. And we certainly saw at COP26, as you were saying there, a shift, I think, in the way that those funders and investment managers are saying now they really want to only be looking at things that have that real climate focus as well. So thanks so much, Michael. I'm going to, just before we hand over to Mariano, thank you so much. The audience already sending in their questions. Please do keep those coming. And Mariano, I'm sure you will pick up on some of those things that Michael said around kind of how do we get people back into work and, you know, how do we get the economy going? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Today, I will present some of the research conducted at the IMF on the employment impact of public investments, including green investments. Next slide, please. So this research was first published in the Fiscal Monitor, which appears twice a year and is directed to mostly public officials, public servants. And in the second chapter of the Fiscal Monitor, we covered what are the policies for the recovery, including getting people back to work. Next slide, please. So the research had ample coverage. A follow-up was a blog that people can just type IMF chart of the week with the research, and also a working paper that is published. Next, please. And there is no relation between James Bond and the work conducted at the IMF, although we were under pressure to deliver very quickly the results. Next, please. So the key question during the height of the pandemic, about 500 million jobs were lost. We know from previous research that public works work. So during the Great Depression, for example, the Big Deal, or the American Reconstruction and Recovery Act during the crisis of 2008, 2009. So the question was, next please, how many jobs can be created by public investment? And this question we tackled in a different way. So we covered by sector, by income group, countries, and we parameterized labor intensity and labor mobility, and I will show in a second. Next, please. So the overview was to cover the main infrastructure sectors: education, health, electricity, roads, and water and sanitation. And the income groups of countries is the classification we hold at the IMF: advanced economies, emerging market economies, and we also, for the lack of data, we extrapolated to low-income developing countries. Next, please. The methodology is from micro data to macro data. So how much $1 million spent in public works would increase employment in the companies involved. Next, please. The results are that $1 million can create between 3 and 7 jobs, stable jobs in advanced economies, between 10 and 17 in emerging market economies, and in low-income countries, between 16 and 30. Green investments and research and development have a higher impact, and overall, on a global scale, 1% of GDP can increase 7 million jobs worldwide. Next slide, please. And here we come to the center. What are the results by sector and by income group? The brackets, minimum, maximum, depend on labor mobility between companies within a sector. So if employees are more flexible due to regulations or hiring processes to move from one company to the other, then the labor impact of public investments is higher. Similarly, if there is a higher content of labor intensity within the industry and within the income group, there may be, for example, more capital intensive that has lower labor impact, employment impact, but with higher labor intensity. Of course, $1 million will imply higher effects. Overall, we can see that, for example, for advanced economies, the highest multiplier, employment multiplier, is achieved in energy, where $1 million can create around 8 jobs, stable jobs. Whereas in low-income countries, the higher multiplier comes from water and sanitation, about 30 jobs for each for $1 million of spending in public works. Next slide, please. And with this one, I conclude. So efficiency aside, we know that from previous research that labor force in state-owned enterprises has higher job intensity. Therefore, if the aim of the government is to quickly increase employment, state-owned enterprises is a way to channel it. Second, next, please. Second, private investments are not a panacea for limited fiscal space, especially because it's not free money. And second, because normally fiscal space correlate with state capacity. And countries that do not have fiscal space also are weak in state capacity to be able to absorb and properly regulate private investments. Next, please. Finally, just to be clear, the green investments are also may not be rich in the job rich in the long term. For example, if we have a solar panel, well, it's the installment, but in the long run, it may not create jobs in that particular sector. And one thing to bear in mind, whereas as my previous colleagues mentioned, green investments are welfare enhancing globally, it may not be welfare enhancing for a particular country in a particular moment that are more suitable for, or the cost of transition will be higher. Therefore, we have to develop these transfer schemes to compensate those countries that for whom the transition will be more costly. Thank you very much, and I'm willing to answer to the questions I may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariano, and thank you to all of you for fantastic presentations. And I have to say, I've been doing these webinars for quite a while, and you're definitely the best panel in terms of keeping to time on your presentation. So thank you so much for that. Mariano, lots of interesting points raised. They're really good to hear about the report from the IMF. Fascinating about what types of investment actually produce what types of employment, and different in different countries and in different sectors. But interesting the point that you made that overall green investment leads to higher employment, or at least in certain types of economies. And one of the things that I want to pick up on there, and it's also a question that we've had in from the audience. So Mariano, I'll start with you because you raised that in terms of this isn't the same for every country. So for kind of low income countries, the transition is going to be different. And you raised there the risks if civil servants don't recognize that, if the global community doesn't necessarily recognize that. So I think my question to all of you is, when it comes to thinking about these public investment decisions, how can we ensure that this is done in a way that's fair for all countries, that we recognize those different inequalities? And we've had a question come in from Loiso Makwana, who says a similar thing. What are some of the key considerations for economies that are energy and coal intensive that should inform the just transition? So Mariano, I'm going to come back to you first because you ended on kind of this point, and then I'll put that same question to each member of the panel.
Yes, thank you for the question. This was related to my last point, where we talk in economics Pareto efficiency. Pareto efficiency is that the cake is bigger, but nobody has a smaller piece. And with the transition, it will happen that the cake will be bigger, but some countries will have a smaller piece in that cake. Therefore, we have to think of transfers to also compensate with the surplus for those countries. This is called the Hicks-Kaldor efficiency, where we also incorporate transfers. How those transfers may materialize? Well, it can be, for example, preferable loans or some sort of grants to make the transition easier for countries that are highly dependent in what they produce on carbon emissions. If a country, without saying any number, but a country's economy is relying on fossil fuels, coal, just saying, oh, you have to cut your emissions will not be fair, especially if the country is underdeveloped and the way to catch up is maybe to emit a little bit more to catch up for those countries that during the Industrial Revolution were emitting more carbon. So how do we compensate those countries? That is an open question, but there are several ways of compensating, and we have to acknowledge that it's not just only setting limits and imposing those limits, but we have to go back to what is historically fair for those countries that were not emitting in previous years to allow them to catch up to levels of development as in emerging markets or developing economies.
Thanks, Mariano. I mean, EPEC, this question of fairness and equality is obviously something right at the heart of ODI. So your thoughts on this issue as well?
Thanks, Siobhan. I'd actually like to echo Mariano's point about it being an international effort. And actually at the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, we saw a first ever initiative supporting South Africa's energy transition. And it was an international initiative launched by the UK, France, Germany, with support from the US and the EU. I believe the Commission also supported, because they recognize that this is not a transition that South Africa can make on their own. So more international initiatives on supporting the just transition are, I think, critical to this. And, you know, looking at countries' different energy and development pathways, some countries are still, you know, grappling with, in addition to the results of the pandemic, their own development goals and having to balance between implementing sustainable development goals and different objectives in healthcare, education, energy access, for example. And there we have to think, you know, case by case basis, looking at where a country is with regards to the options that are available for them and the financing that will allow that to happen. In particular, in terms of energy access, you know, there are now a lot of initiatives that allow for distributed sort of renewable energy access, but they do come at a higher price in the short term. And so, you know, if the support can be provided, then countries are able to make this transition. And as you say, finally, you know, looking at where countries are in terms of supporting their sectors, and I think this was one of the questions that came in as well, that are going to be on their way out, they have to think about the workers and communities involved in those sectors, whether it's early retirement schemes or you know, retraining and skills development in these new sectors. Again, those have to be provided. Also to support you know, the general public in supporting this transition. You know, there's been a lot of backlash in countries where governments have made these decisions very quickly, increased prices for consumers, and, you know, as we've seen in Kazakhstan and in France some years ago, you know, this leads to a lot of backlash. So the general public have to be brought along as well, and for that the government has to show that they are supporting the transition.
Thanks, Ipe, which picked up Mariano's point about the risk of backlash as well if you bring these things in without thinking about those kind of issues. Christiana, you can very much answer as well on the question of equality and fairness, but also there's a question specifically for you, which is just, is the EU net zero the same definition as the one in the UK? So you mentioned carbon neutral, but net zero and carbon neutral are not the same in the UK. So just could you give a flavour of the terminology, I guess, around that? And then if you want also your thoughts on the equality issue.
Thank you. So I would be very brief on the equality issue in saying that we definitely need a coordinated effort in tackling this, and that the EU is very much supporting and pushing for coordination in all the global fora, the G7, the G20. So there is a lot being done there. A specific point I would add to the challenge is that in terms of the management of the public investment and the implementation of the public investment, the research and the evidence points that this will be an additional challenge for emerging and developing economies, because they appear to have a less efficient management than the advanced economies. So this will be an additional challenge to what we've been discussing. And then to the particular question on terminology. So thanks a lot for bringing that up. I think indeed the 2050 target is about carbon neutrality, which is different. So it means that you can offset, that the emissions should be offset to zero. So that is different from the net concept in the UK. But at the same time, I would also mention that the intermediate targets at the EU level set for 2030 speaks explicitly about a net reduction of 55% in emissions. So you have a different ambition level depending on the timeline.
Okay, thanks, Christiana. Michael, I'm going to come to you. Again, you can give your thoughts on the issue of kind of equality and fairness of the transition, but there's also a specific question come in for you from John Gower. And the question is there an opportunity for insurance and pension funds to invest in decarbonisation and especially building flood defences? It's in their long-term interest to prevent future impacts such as flooding, and investment in renewable energy will likely pay good financial dividends. So this has been put to you. Other people might have thoughts on that as well, but any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, and it is already happening in terms of pension funds, life insurance, those type of companies investing surplus funds or their investment funds into infrastructure projects, including the energy. And you know, have they gone? Most of them have been in more mature markets, which are used to infrastructure financing, particularly the UK as sort of starter, but it's also elsewhere. I guess in some ways it comes back to this, you know, that equality question is sometimes the issue is around getting the funding in. And sometimes and while there's lots of support from EU and World Bank and particularly in emerging markets, what you need to get is these type of, you know, pension funds and setting up the structure appropriately, that you're allowing these long-term funds in, because most of those are looking to put money away for longer term. The returns that they require are less, and infrastructure is a lower risk project, particularly if wrapped by the likes of World Bank or EU or whatever. So if you get that structured right, you can get more of these capital sources into these type of projects. And you're right in terms of you know, flood damage and you know, protecting all the real estate. All of those things are good. You know, it's preventative rather than you know, solving disasters in time. So all of those are yes, that definitely can happen. But you need structure, but you need and depending on the where you're investing and the maturity of that market, you might need further supports from the large entities and large development bank type of support, and that can make these happen.
Thanks. Well, on that issue of preventative, my question to all of you, just very quick thoughts on this, because we've got lots of questions coming in from the audience to get through. But and I think you all mentioned at some point kind of better risk impact assessments and risk management in these areas. Do you think civil servants in different countries around the world, do you think they understand enough about the cost of inaction as well as they do at factoring in the cost of action? Is that something, do you think, that civil servants need to get better at? Ipek, you're kind of nodding your head on this one. I'm going to ask.
I think it's because all of us need to understand it better. I mean, we shouldn't just point a finger at civil servants. These are very difficult calculations, but I think they're also very frightening ones. So I mean, that was part of what I was trying to say in my presentation, that we just don't see the longer term picture and the bigger term picture. And we're very proud of what we can achieve and what we've been able to do. And governments in particular are very proud of their green investments, but we just don't see the cost of and the risks of inaction. And, you know, I think it would make a lot of sense for governments to support their civil servants in getting better training in this. And financial institutions are doing better at this now. But because if we don't understand the cost of stranded assets, the cost of the risks, the disasters, the physical costs of stranding of these assets, but also of extreme weather events, which will continue to amplify. I think, you know, one thing we are finally seeing, unfortunately, is the physical impact and the sort of implications of climate change, with the weather patterns really changing and extreme weather events occurring more and more, you know, from floods to wildfires to tornadoes, etc., really occurring more regularly. And so at least there is a public awareness of this. But as you say, I think we have to follow through in terms of really mainstreaming these kind of analysis to the decisions that we're making every day and civil.
Thanks, Ipek. Mariano, you've worked in a ministry yourself. Do you think, you know, you understand politicians always have to justify what they spend their money on? Do you think they have to justify what they don't spend their money on, you know, enough? I need to take you off mute, Mariano, I think. There we go.
Yes. Well, this is also a political economy question, whether the constituencies, what do they require from politicians? In my own experience, and also in research that I have done on political contestability, normally actions are more risky than inaction. Therefore, the equilibrium is that a politician prefers to not act than to take a risky action. Or when acting, also another risk is to make all the actions very rigid, very regulated, extremely narrow in the flexibility to take different paths, so that at the end I can say I played by the book. So playing by the book is what is always said that I have to do. And an inaction, normally there is no sense of omission, or there are very little in the textbook. Therefore, for a politician in general, it's better to enact, which is very inefficient, especially in decarbonizing the economy, because we have to take some actions. But taking some actions have the risk of making some of the constituencies very angry, and those constituencies may be more powerful than the whole majority.
Yeah, thanks, Mariano. We've got so many questions. I'm actually going to, Cristiano, I'm going to put this to you, but I'm going to bring in another question because I think it links nicely to it. So this is from Rashid Nabi, who asks, are governments ready to introduce regulations and policies to discourage investments in fossil fuel? Their infrastructure packages still encourage fossil fuel-based industries. I think this goes back to what Ipek was saying, that it's not fast enough, that we are not investing in some of the fossil fuels. Your thoughts on that, Cristiano?
Yes, so if I may first react to what Mariano said, I found extremely interesting on the lack of attention to inaction. And I would just like to echo that. I think much of the work that we are doing, and the one that I see, is very much focused on what we could do and how could implement these targets and doing more to achieve them, but not so much on inaction. I think on there is less, but it's increasing to become more. more. And here I can relate to this discussion that we are having on the costs of disasters that are, as Isipek also said, they are becoming increasingly mainstream now because they are so visible. I think even my grandmother can mention, she knows of extreme events somewhere in Southeast Asia. So it's becoming increasingly, the awareness is definitely increasing, but the question is whether it's fast enough. On the question of discouraging fossil fuels, so I think here as well, what I see is that the approach is quite gradual as well. So rather than, taking very bold steps and banning certain industries, I think the approach still seems to be more in the sense of encouraging the alternative energy sources and so on. But I think the pressure is really on the policymakers to become bolder there. But then I would say the approach still appears to be more gradual, maybe than expected.
Thanks, Christiana. Michael, from your perspective, working kind of straddling private and public sector, would you like to see governments introduce more regulations and policies to kind of force pace of change?
No, the private sector will want more transactions that they can get involved in. So there's a demand for and a desire to get involved in these type of projects. So I think if government can, remain committed to those spends that they're putting forward as from a national development plans and whatever, align that with climate, even if they don't have the capital, there is a pool of money that's available to support that, and so anything that can help that along. I mean, regulation and more if it creates blockages or red tape, that's not a great thing. But I think it's more about how do you get, think about getting these delivered. What's the way to do that? Because that is that overall positive piece, and as long as they align with that overall strategy, with the target towards carbon neutral, all of those elements, then the funding and once it achieves those objectives and you work your way through it, the funding of it should be the second piece of the consideration rather than the primary piece, because you need to figure out what project you need to implement. And so it is whatever is needed to keep these projects moving, and for government to stay committed and willing to spend, including all their evaluations and doing all the right things, but making sure that it's not that funding point, because that bringing in private capital can deliver these, can still achieve all that government wants to, and ultimately we get the final result that we're looking for.
Thanks, Michael. We've got loads of questions coming in, which is really good to see. There's one here that builds on something that you said, Mariano, where you said that green investments don't necessarily lead to long-term job growth. So you mentioned kind of the installation of solar panels. And the question from Justin Souls then is, I'm curious as to the panel's thoughts with regards to job growth and transitions via government intervention in digital transformation initiatives. So Christiana, you mentioned kind of the green priorities that the EU Commission had alongside kind of digital priorities as well. So thoughts about not just kind of green investments, but how investing in digital might actually help some of these long-term issues going forward. I can see, Mariano, that you are nodding. I'm going to come to Christiana first and then to Mariano, because I'm not sure if you pulled that out in your report as well, Mariano. But Christiana, your thoughts on digital and how that might help going forward.
Yes, so definitely, and just to re-emphasize the point that on the slide, so indeed the Commission recognizes that the digital investments can to a large extent support the green transition, and that there is this digital target in the RRF, in the 5-year recovery plan, and which we've seen was overachieved, and so not only there, but there is a lot of additional initiatives at the EU level aiming to support the digital infrastructure. So I'm not super informed about that, but I know there is a lot going on, including establishing a unique digital market. So that's definitely very high on the agenda.
Thanks, Christiana. Mariano, I can see you eager to get in here on the digital side of things.
Well, actually, we are working at the IMF now in the costing of digital infrastructure for the world. So how much it would take for all countries individually to achieve the SDG goals of connectivity by 2030. That said, digitalization increases, of course, productivity is the way to go, but is not clear whether that would lead to lower emissions. And let me give you a simple example. If we have good digital infrastructure, maybe we need to commute less, so we use less cars. But the economy increases and we may have more trade, internal trade, which also produces carbon, more pizzas to be delivered home. So the net at the end is still unclear. Our models are ambiguous in what would be the result. So what is, from an economic point of view, enhancing for growth may not be necessarily good for carbon emissions. So we have to think in parallel that digitalization does not equal zero emissions. Digitalization is moving to another economy, type of economy. We want to move there, but we have to think in parallel how to keep emissions low.
Thanks, Mariano. Michael, I'm going to ask you.
Sorry, I was just going to pick up on that digital piece, if I might, Siobhan, just briefly. I mean, I think there's two things. One is that digital infrastructure is now becoming what was deemed essential infrastructure. So, you know, so where previously we needed our roads and our rail to get around, now we need broadband and 5G in order to do things like we're doing now at the moment. So I think that's a critical piece, and that has impact on that. The other bit I would say is the use of digital within our project, particularly infrastructure projects. We use a lot of work around digital twins. And so when that early evaluation, understanding what the impact of various projects, you know, if you're building something or doing something and changing something, not only looking at things like mobility, but also looking at what the environmental impact would be. And then you're able to plan that and see how that goes forward. And we're even able to do that on existing infrastructure, because what we've been doing in some parts of the world is putting sensors across the entire transport network, road network of large areas. And what that does is first allows us to see what the movement of traffic is, and we can understand and start simulating that, and seeing how can you change that to make to reduce the emissions. And so if you've got a smoother traffic flows, less starting and accelerating, all that sort of stopping and accelerating, all of those things are positive from an environmental point of view. So use technology and digital embedded within infrastructure to do that. What then that allows you to do is move from simulation to actual traffic management. And now all those, what was a simulation tool is now there, and you can manage your entire traffic system with an emissions and an environmental focus rather than just a traffic and mobility piece. So I think there's a lot of bits that digital and tech can start providing within this and can help. But you know, it's a long way to go.
Thanks, Michael. Ipek, I'm going to come to you in a moment. I know you're keen to get in on a couple of the other questions, but Michael, just picking up on that, there was a question directly for you from Paolo. I think you might have just answered it, but I'm going to read it out in case you want to add anything. So Paolo says, my question is for Michael. I wonder if the model you propose, so stimuli to economic activity, assisting businesses and getting individuals back to work, really responds to the need to move to a new paradigm beyond a traditional economy. What about ideas related to communities, communal management of resources, etc.? Thank you. But I think you might have just answered that in saying there's a future.
Yeah, I think what I was saying is that you know, just focus on jobs and distressed businesses and all of that was the old way.
Yeah.
Society is saying you've got to look at this differently, and I think governments are doing that. And so yes, it looks at communities, it looks at investment with a clean growth, that equality and there's a sharing piece that falls into that, which is where the communities and putting in the infrastructure to allow that to happen, like digital, like broadband, all of those sort of things, I think are relevant. So yeah, I mean, it has evolved from that old way of doing it, and I think it's going to, with a bit of luck, it will stay that way.
Yeah, thanks. So we've got a couple of questions here that are a bit more kind of specific, I think, about some specific environmental issues. Let me just bring up. So Peter has asked, governments are promoting the use of electric vehicles and the banning of the sale of fossil fuel burning vehicles to meet the net zero commitments. However, the extraction of materials required for EV batteries involve controversial practices in extracting them in other countries where human rights may be violated. How do we ensure an ethical and reliable source of materials in the supply chain for the production of electric vehicles? So I think this goes back to this sense of, you have to look across the supply chain. We're looking at social issues, equality issues, not just environmental or economic issues as well. Ipak, your thoughts on this?
I mean, unfortunately, green doesn't always mean, everything will be good and easy. I think that's the challenge. And yes, some of these issues and concerns that have existed around extractives, in fossil fuel extractives and other mining, will continue to be the case in these technologies. So, as I was saying earlier, we have to look at the broader development goals, sustainable development goals, and broader objectives. And that's why, many departments are looking at these ESG issues altogether. So it is a case of balancing these different considerations. But absolutely, we can't just say we can go green at the cost of obviously humanitarian issues. Actually, some work we're doing at ODI at the moment is looking at the inequality impact of some of the green policies. And again, similar challenges exist there. You can't automatically put in place measures that are going to be at the detriment of people. So absolutely very valid point, Peter, and there are initiatives now starting to tackle that.
Christiana, thanks Ipak. Christiana, is this something that you're thinking about at that EU level as well?
Yeah, so it's really an important issue, and there is no simple way to deal with it, but there are some ways that the Commission is exploring. So I could mention there this principle of do no significant harm, for example, it's part of the taxonomy, classifying the environmental sustainability activities. So, the investment that you make should not make a significant harm. And then on the issue of the supply chain, an initiative that the Commission is considering looks at taxing a tax on the carbon intensity of imported goods. So I think that can address some of the issues related to goods that come, outside the EU, and that may have some of the challenges that were raised.
Thanks, Christian. Mariano or Michael, did you want to come in on this issue, or should we move on to the next question? No, Mariano? No. Okay.
Well, two small issues. One is the question is very well placed because, for example, solar panels is zero emissions in the place of use, but it's not zero emissions in the place where they are produced. Yeah. So it's like transferring where the carbon production is placed. And normally, unfortunately, it happens in low-income countries where the extractives are. So that is to keep it very clear there. So we need to compensate for those investments.
Thanks. Okay, so we've got a different type of question here. This is coming from Tabasi Masala, who asks, what role does the insurance industry play in protecting the infrastructure investment? Could its ability to protect investment limit progress that is needed? I am going to ask Michael for his thoughts on this.
An easy one, yeah. Look, firstly, insurance is important in these projects, particularly if you bring in private finance. You will not get private finance without insurance, and so in that way, it's not an inhibitor. I think again, you probably want to properly structure it in order to get it in there and have appropriate insurance cover. But it's there, but you can only insure certain things, and it's what are you trying to insure, and so it's only an inhibitor if you try and go overboard on it, and then certain as I said, certain risks are not insurable. But the funding sector understands that and understands what can and can't be done, and so you're protecting certain levels. And if the risk is too high and it's not insurable, well, that's where there's other entities can come in and wrap around that, and or maybe it's public sector assume that risk as they do in other things. So again, it shouldn't be the thing that holds us up. That said, if it goes to such an extent that it's a problem, well, then maybe the project is structured, or whether the entirety of it is too risky anyway, that maybe you need to restart and have a look at it and see whether you should try again in terms of the approach.
Right, thanks, Michael. Mariano, did you have any thoughts on the insurance question?
Yes, so from an economic point of view, insurance adds to the cost. The normal view from Arrow and Lind 1970 is that the public sector insures in itself, because it's better to transfer different risk from different industries without the markup of the insurance. If markets are incomplete, if markets are complete and we are in an efficient economy, insurance is well priced. But generally, for risk there are, when we are in the unknown, we don't know what are the unknowns of the future, and we don't know the distributions of those unknowns. It may make sense for the public sector to step in as a global insurance. So in transitioning to a zero economy, carbon economy, it may make sense for the public sectors to step in to cover for what would be an expensive insurance from the private insurers.
Okay, thanks, Mariano. I'm going to move on because I can't believe the time, how quickly it's gone. We've probably only got time for one more round of questions. But before we get to that, just want to say thank you for the audience for being so brilliant and sending in so many questions. Don't worry, if we don't manage to answer every single question today, we'll make sure they get answered behind the scenes after the webinar. So we will make sure that is done. And also just to say, please, we'll send an email out with a survey that should be in your inboxes now. If you could take a couple of minutes to fill in that survey, that questionnaire, that would be great for us. It just means that we make sure we give you the webinars that are best suited for you, that meet your needs the most. So thank you in advance from me for doing that. So I'm going to give you two policy questions to end with, policy related questions to the panel, and you can choose to answer one or both of those questions. We've had such diverse questions coming in. So one is from Brent Waite, and Brent asks, to achieve net zero targets, what is being taken into consideration for minimizing defense and military energy use? So do you think that's being considered enough by governments when they're talking about their net zero targets, and how can they do more on that side of things? And the other question I wanted to pick up was from John Gower, who said that, has any work been done on equating the cost and success risks of fossil fuel power generation or manufacturing with carbon capture against renewable power generation? Because this could be useful for lower income economies, for example, with fossil fuel reserves being helped to develop carbon capture. So it could be helpful for kind of lower income countries. So your thoughts there on kind of carbon capture risks versus renewable power generation, or the issue about has kind of the energy needed for defense and military kind of activities been fully taken into account by different countries? Ipek, I'm going to start with you on these, and we're going to have to keep our answers quite brief, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Siobhan. I'm afraid I don't know much about military spending, but I assume, and levels of fossil fuel consumption, I assume they're very high. But I'll leave that to someone who knows more than me. I think on carbon capture, these technologies are still not developed enough. They're still very, very expensive, especially at the scale that would be needed. I think the fossil fuel industry, of course, is trying to promote them as much as possible. But if you look at the institutions that are analyzing these longer term scenarios, they do build in some of these unproven, untested technologies in the longer term. But ideally, in terms of from a risk perspective, more emphasis on renewable solutions. And of course, the one carbon capture technology that we can use at scale, which is trees. And so there is a lot of work to be done in terms of limiting deforestation and reforestation initiatives, etc., where we know that the costs and the workings of that technology are much more proven. So a little bit of a distraction and a bit of an excuse for the prolonging of fossil fuel sectors. Of course, we should explore all of the options in the longer term to make sure that we avoid climate disaster, but we should not sway from the much more pragmatic and proven solutions of renewable technologies, the costs of which have come down dramatically in the recent years, bearing in mind Mariano's perspective point on, of course, there is a cost of producing solar panels and wind turbines and all of these as well, and an impact of that. But yes, I think we should not put too much reliance on those technologies. Thanks.
Thanks, Ipek. Michael, your final thoughts on this? We need to take you off mute. Thanks, Michael.
Sorry. Yeah. So look, defense is a challenge, right? So they produce a lot, but it is very difficult to win the discussion with their perceived need for protection and defense and security versus climate, and I think in the current environment and at this stage is likely to be only one winner in that discussion. I think there will be future that there's a greater focus on climate, and I think particularly the ancillary areas around defense, bases and etc. will get there, but it is probably they have other objectives ahead that lie ahead. I think the other bit in terms of developing markets, I think, and fossil fuels, I mean, that is just going to take longer, and because you've got a funding issue as well as that reliance. However, I think the point was well made. I mean, it is getting cheaper to shift over. It is, if you structure these properly, use the supports that are available from the development banks and all that is there in order to push these forward, well, then you can start that transition, and it's got to start somewhere. But it is going to be slower than probably people would like, but that's the nature of it. But it does have to start, and I think there's lots of supports in order to that can make that happen.
Thanks, Michael. Mariano, your final thoughts on these issues?
So my final thought would not be very positive. First is that climate seems to be a residual of other actions. The big economies are trying to secure resources. For example, lithium mines are only in several places in the world. Therefore, defense spending to secure those places or to get to those in a realistic perspective are not going to diminish, but are maybe even increased. With that said, climate may be like a second order concern and not the first one to tackle. On the positive side, several military powers have minima, for example, for biodiesel use. So they try to incorporate some sort of limiting the carbon emissions. I know that the US, I think it's 20% that has to be biodiesel. Don't quote me on that, but there is a minimum of use. So they are acknowledging that they have to reduce their own carbon footprint.
Thanks, Mariano. Christiana, we started with you. I'm going to end with you. Are you as pessimistic, or have you got some optimism in there as well?
So I'm by nature a bit more optimistic, but I think the task is very challenging. And in addition to all these trade-offs that we've been discussing about on the technology side, on the funding side, I think one element that is also very important and cannot be minimized is the social impact of this transition. And I think there I want to emphasize that really the Commission is very vocal about that, and I think that's also partly why the change is so gradual, because we have to make sure that, you know, the economic adjustment is as fair as possible, and that's not easy to do. So I would end on this note.
Thanks, Christiana. And I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the discussion. So a fantastic discussion there. And I think it just shows, as you all kind of set out in your opening remarks, really, that a lot has been done. We have made progress. Countries are making progress. But undeniably, I think there's still huge challenges ahead and still a lot more that people need to be doing. And civil servants and public servants will all play their part in that. And I think it's really interesting that those big issues around inequality and justice and fairness and the transition have all come up so much in this conversation. So thank you so much to the audience for sending in their questions. Thank you to our fantastic panel, to Mariano, to Ipek, to Michael, and to Christiana. Thank you for sharing so much of your time and expertise with us. To all of the audience, we will be sending you a link with a video of this conversation, so you can watch it all again at your leisure. You can share it with colleagues as well. And there will also be a write-up of the key issues that came out of the conversation today, and that will be with you in a week or so's time. So thank you so much from me, wherever you are around the world today. And thank you to our knowledge partner, Deloitte. And I hope that we see you all again at another webinar very soon. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the day.